Prison guards of Reddit, what's the scariest day on the job you've ever had? Not a prison guard. But spent 18 months in Illinois Department of Corrections. There was an older dude that was a major prick. Like bad. He hated anyone wearing blues. Lived to throw you and seg and do his best to get your good time taken away. He had a scar across his throat. Turns out in the late 80s early 90s a few prisons in Statesville got out of control. Took him and his wife hostage. Took turns raping her in front of him. Then slit his throat. Both lived. Why did he continue being a guard, though I was in a minimum security when I knew him? Statistical is a max. I'll never know. 1997 local jail with a very big budget crisis. Jail was on the 4th floor of the courthouse and the chow hall was in the basement. The elevator was junk. It broke down with me and 13 felony inmates. 4 were convicted murderers waiting on a bed to come open at the prison. I was trapped in a very tight space with some very bad people unarmed and alone. They helped me crawl through the escape hatch in the roof of the elevator so I could get help. No escape attempts and no violence. It was scary. But went pretty well considering. I was a prison guard in Afghanistan in 2011 at the DFIP. I think somewhere around December. We had a Quran burning incident. And tensions were very high between the US and any of the local nationals or the Afghan National Army. People were dying because of riots outside base. This was some serious shit. We were receiving threats from some of the people we worked with. The scariest day was when I was searching a communal cell some days after the Quran burning. Usually the CO here was 6 months pregnant and got followed into a cell as I was doing cell checks. The inmate threatened to stab me with a sharpened pencil. I had caught him muscling inmates into giving him free phone calls earlier and gave him a warning. My partner was supposed to watching my back to make sure I was not followed, but he was not one for giving a shit. Luckily, the inmate saw that I had my hand on my radio and he let me continue on my checks. I worked in an open concept unit where the inmates have free roam of the unit and the guard's desk is inside the unit with no protection. A lot of staff get complacent and assume nothing bad will happen. Long story short, I went on sick leave the following week until my maternity leave kicked in. Not worth the risks. My dad is a prison guard. Well, technically now he works maintenance, but he used to be a legit guard. Anyways, one day he caught someone throwing drugs over the fence, so he hopped in his truck and was driving over. When the guy saw him, he ran into the woods next to the prison. My dad hopped out and ran after him. Eventually, they made it to a clearing, and when my dad caught a glimpse of him, he had his hand on his hip like he was reaching for a gun. My dad wasn't armed. So at this point he was thinking, shit, what am I supposed to do now? So he puts his own hand on his hip and yells at the guy to get down, and my dad pretended to have a gun. The guy freaked and got down. Ends up he was reaching for a phone to get back up. But I think it's funny that my dad pulled a Paul Blart. I was one for 2 years before I left. I want to preface this by saying do not work for North Carolina. So we are so understaffed that we were working upwards of 80 to 90 hours a week. I was also working nights. Some nights I'd be in a dorm setup like military barracks and it'd just be 2 officers to 136 inmates. Also, the equipment we had didn't work. Our radios were fubered. Our pepper spray out of date for 6 years and only half of the prison cameras worked. My other officer was asleep by 9:30 p.m. as was pretty usual for the sorry pieces of shit that I worked with. I was making rounds to make sure nobody had died within the last 15 minutes when all of a sudden my baton clip breaks off my belt and the baton rolls in front of 34 inmates who are not locked down and freely moving about the room. I calmly walked over to the baton that had stopped right in front of an inmate's bed and picked it up and left. Luckily nothing happened. But it was the thoughts of what could have happened that drove me to find another job. I could have died that night or any night with a sleeping officer one room over. Without a working radio to call for backup or a camera to even show which person f***ing killed me. I saw so much corruption and dirt in that job that I'll never want to work for any law enforcement agency again. I sincerely hope that it turns around one day, but it will have to without me. My father has been a CO for the past 10 years. One story that still sticks out to me today involves him routinely checking inmate cells. One cell in particular had inmates that kept to themselves for the most part. They hardly spoke to one another, or the COs. Except for this night. My dad had heard screaming in the typically quiet cell. As he approached, he saw inmate number 1 laying in bed resting as if nothing's happened. Inmate number 2, however, was screaming, crying, and appeared to be holding one of his eyeballs in his palm. It was dangling by the optic nerve and was turning greyish and foamy. They had to take him to the hospital in hopes of saving his eye. Come to find out, inmate number 1 decided to scoop his cellmate's eyeball out with a spoon because he wanted peace and quiet. Double quote. There's other stories, but that I will always remember that one. The day we got our first conservative convict. He was framed for a crime by the deep state, and all prison guards know conservatives are true alphas and very powerful. There was no way to know how he would respond backed into a corner. We feared for the lives of all the weak Democrats locked up. Just because of the paperwork required of this alpha Republican decided to teach them some manners. Standing on the front stoop of my apartment at 3 AM smoking a cigarette. Dead effkin silence the entire time I was standing there. All at once a train horn blows. The little 6-year-old girl next door screams and a wind gust comes out of nowhere, slamming the open door against my shoulder. I swear to God, for exactly 1 second I thought I was being attacked by a ghost. My heart was pounding and I thought I was gonna cry. That shit probably took 2 years off of my life. For the record, little girl screamed probably cause her and her mama always stayed up late and were probably playing. I was a prison guard at the prison and I accidentally got locked inside of a cell with a prisoner. He attacked me right away. He hit me over the head with a 2x4, then he pulled out a shank that he was hiding in his boot. He started stabbing me and I was losing a lot of blood, but then I got a second wind and I gathered all my strength and I hit him with a jumping shuriken, and luckily I knocked him right out. I guess some of the other prisoners were watching the fight from their cells because they all started clapping for me and then they started chanting my name. I'll never forget it. Ex-prison guard riot officer here. When prisoners are getting transported jail to jail or jail to courthouse, the convoy can't not be stopped under any circumstances. Prisoners manage to hide razor blades, then cut themselves up and bleed near to death if they are put in a transportation cell with a gay guy. It is considered unclean to be in the same cell with a lower level or gay prisoner, so they harm themselves in order to prove their strength. There have also been cases where the stronger prisoner manages to uncuff himself and then up-airs his cellmate and lie during the jail-to-jail transportation. You can't stop though to help. But the convoy guard seats are faced towards the inmates in order to see them at all times. And the inmate transportation cells are made of bulletproof glass. Imagine having to go through a 3-hour journey, being forced to look at a prisoner and lie raping another prisoner. Also, the weakest inmates in jail swallow all types of items in order to be put to hospital and avoid daily harm done to them. The most common item is a spoon. Not a CO, but had spent a couple weeks locked up. They put me on D. Was 19 working as CO, and of all the scary, I guess I'll go with a fight on the big yard and 2 small yards at one time. Was working one of the yards and the chaos that surrounded it was wild. A few people stabbed and some sock parties. Got it locked down fairly quick, but the time in between was pretty wild. Other time was first week on block and walking tries when I stepped into a room. Inmate stepped eye behind me, closed door and flipped lights off. Only thing I heard was, "What you gonna do?" In my best big boy voice I said, "I may lose, but someone's about to know I was here." Thank the Lord it was just a test and they actually played the "we were just checking you." I think I pooped myself a little. Not me, but my grandma. She was a nurse for all of her life. When she retired from her rehab care facility job, she worked as a medicine passer in our local county prison. I remember her telling me about how surprisingly nice a lot of the people in there were to her. Even the ones that looked scary. She talked about the nice ones all the time, but refused to talk about people who were the latter. The one time she did tell us about one of the rude inmates. It was pretty scary just listening to it. He told her that he wasn't happy with the fact that he was only being prescribed solo of the medicine he was getting. Probably due to his health or some sort of other concern. My grandma said that the sizes of prescriptions weren't in her control. That she simply only works the window of passing them out. He didn't take it lightly. He threatened to hang her on the cafeteria meat hooks just because she didn't try to get him more medicine than he was intended. Very freaky Fkin moment for her. Still don't know how she kept her cool throughout it. So, some background first. I played basketball a lot. 4 years of varsity in high school and then 3 years in college. Anyway, I was a guard for about 2 years when the prison I worked at got a famous NBA player as an inmate, won't name him for obvious reasons. My boss was an amateur hoop head with a massive ego. So after a while he challenged the NBA guy to some 2-on-2. The NBA player with the worst inmate he could find. And my boss with me. The best CO he could find. It was a 3-game series. The inmates won the first and we won the second. The NBA player saw my skill and told me he could put me in contact with a training camp for an NBA team, and he even thought I had a real chance of making a team. After that I decided I didn't want to do the third game. And to save up my effort for the camp. Well, my arsehole boss decided to tease an inmate who made a bet on the third game saying that I would whoop some real ass. Apparently the inmate wasn't willing to lose that money. So he got other members of his crew to attack me. And cut my Achilles tendon. After I healed up I could walk. But I can't play basketball seriously anymore. All for a bet on a meaningless 2-on-2 series. The scariest days are always the ones where the inmates get drunk from homemade prison alcohol. Google Pruno to understand what I mean, but the short explanation is it's a combination of fruit, sugar and a heat source that produces something that smells foul but will get you drunk like any other alcohol. Understand that most inmates are in there because of violent and crazy shit they did while drunk. When they get drunk in jail, holy shit. We do what we can to confiscate it, but inmates are creative types in hiding it. Last incident we had resulted in 2 inmates trashing the common room. 6-7 more barricading themselves in their cells, resulting in the TAC team being called. They pepper sprayed them all. Extracted them from their cells and flashbangs were used in some cases. Have been a CO for 2 years now. 1. First night shift. Counting prisoners. Walk past a cell at 1 AM and see a prisoner sitting on his bed. Think nothing of it and keep counting. 2 cells along and curiosity get the best of me and I return to his cell. Shine my torch inside and see him with razor in hand slashing his wrists. Call for backup before accessing his cell. Get him to medical and he gets patched up. Then shifted to a special cell in the medical wing. 2. Running into a fight that is ongoing with one prisoner having the hell kicked out of him. We were an assisted response to the initial support officers. We tackle the attackers and have them escorted away. Once it is all calmed down, we escort the remaining prisoners of the wing back to their cells. Walking back into the wing we realize that the entire floor is covered in blood splatter from the victim. 3. We try not to put ourselves in dangerous situations. We will wait and observe any emergent situation until we have the numbers to safely access the area. Not me, but a family member. He was telling me about a time a female prison guard that he worked with was making her rounds and was being harassed and eventually in the process of beginning to be arped by a group of inmates until the Aryan Brotherhood members jumped in and saved her, escorting the lady to the guard post while the rest of the Brotherhood beat the shit out of the guys doing it. I work for a small jail. Nothing too crazy happens. Female had thrown her sheet over her cell door and tied it to the handle. I just happened to be looking into the cell block and saw her hanging from the door kicking and struggling. Called 0104, suicide in progress, over the radio and ran to the block. Another CO and myself got her down just as she was slipping out of consciousness. She came to and began screaming at us. Placed her on suicide watch in the turtle suit. About 3 years later I saw her out in public and she ran up and gave me a hug and thanked me for helping her. Apparently she was struggling with meth really bad at the time, and when I saw her she had been clean for 2 years. Every day I wonder why in the FCK I keep doing this job, and that one incident was worth it, I suppose. I was deaf guilty when I started the job of thinking everyone in jail was just a sack of shit. But in reality some people just FCK up or have a bad day. Was working at a medium security facility, still had murderers, rapists, gangbangers. They were putting new doors on one of the units. Took 3 months. During the summer, we had to have those inmates move to the gym for those 3 months. Being in a southern state during the summer with close to 200 violent, not all, inmates with no AC in an open environment with no way to lock them down. Every day was nerves on edge. One day 2 Crips saw a Native American guy new to the unit and recognized him from another yard they had all been on at one time. Don't recall the beef they had with this guy, but anyhow the next morning the Crips decide to stab the native guy 17 times and then dropped a microwave on his head. Native guy lived but wasn't in good shape. All of these inmates going nuts and no way of locking them down. Lots of OC spray used that day. Used to work in one of the largest jails around. Had about 60 guys out at the time in a high felony level unit. Walked out to see what the guy was doing, because it seemed like he was up to no good. He was about 6'6" and was much bigger than me. He had broken tiles up from the floor and was using the bricks outside to sharpen the pieces he had tied together. Once I started giving him orders, he was not having it. I thought for sure he was going to stab me during my last week on that job. Backup got there just as I started to square up for the fight and he gave up from being outnumbered. Phew. Not me, but my father-in-law's story. He was a prison guard here in Newfoundland back in the early 90s. A riot broke out and he was taken prisoner by a fellow who was only in there for possession of marijuana with intent to sell. Don't get me started on putting people in jail for selling weed of all things, but prison had taken its toll and he'd stupidly made this decision. He was finally let go after almost a full day of negotiations and still has a scar to this day of when Buddy's knife slipped and cut his neck and cheek. He was given the option to leave after that and he became a firefighter. I think he was really affected by it. He never talks about it, and when he does he only says that the only thing he could think of was not being able to come home to his family. Terrible situation. My mom worked as a psychologist in the mental ward of a maximum security prison in Georgia. Once her and a CO were transferring about 12 prisoners from the mental ward back to the prison. When they got to the space between the 2 fences, the daughter fence wouldn't open and they were trapped. All of these people were mentally unstable and serving life sentences. Nothing happened. But there would have been no way for anyone to help them had anything happened. Late to the party. But I worked for Georgia Department of Corrections. The physical, as stated for a lot of different states, is a f***ing joke. The academy is 5 weeks long and set up for literally anyone to pass. Hell. I was employed on the spot because I had an associate's degree and ran the mile in under the max time, 10 minutes. A 10-minute mile, people. Joke. But the scariest day wasn't even my own. I was working 2 buildings over running yard when a call came out over the radio for assistance needed in Tier 1 lockdown, basically 30-day minimum for being in a shat. So me and another officer run over to see what the problem was. In the lockdown unit the doors have a window and a tray flap. Well, being the shittily maintained facility it was, the inmates could beat on the door hard enough and get them to pop open. When I walked into the building it was like open season for these FKers. Toilet paper, tea, fireballs, you name it. Everything was flying around. They even started flooding, clogging the toilet to cause overflow, so it looked like a f***ing war broke out. Nobody got hurt, luckily. But it took cert, pepper spray, and a lot of force to even get the semblance of control back. Yeah. One of those dorm officers didn't come back the next day. And I don't f***ing blame them. They had to clean that shit up because the orderlies couldn't be trusted to. FCK that place and FCK corrections. I worked part-time in Orleans Parish Prison. I was in Charlie Block. If I recall correctly, a fight broke out. It looked like every inmate in the block was involved. The full-time guard called for help. And as a part-timer, I was told to stay in the guard hut. For context, this short, chubby woman guard told me, a 200-pound active duty marine, to stay in the hut while sorted out a prisoner fight. I thought she was a dead woman walking. Then the front door opened and a dozen other short chubby black women with press-on nails and granite hard elaborate hairdos came through with batons and started wailing on inmates until they had all returned to their cells. It was the scariest, most confusing, funniest thing I have ever seen. This will get buried, not exactly me but sort of. Years later, my mother was a guard while she was pregnant with me before she got too far along. One day an inmate started to square up to her. Some giant dude. Getting ready to fight. Luckily 2 other inmates stepped between them and told the guy to piss off. Crazy to me. All these years later. To think I might owe my life to 2 random inmates who stuck up for my mom. My wife has been a CO at a women's facility for 7 years now. Although there really aren't the immediate physical risks as with a men's facility, the mental toll it takes on you is pretty severe. She is basically subjected to some of the dirtiest, most painful verbal abuse a person so have to put up with. There are good days and bad days. But there are sometimes she just comes home and wants to cry because of the verbal abuse. And as a CO you do your best to keep everything about her life private as to not give them ammunition. That being said, I'd rather be a CO in women's than men's any day. It's defiantly not a picnic. It's just a different form of risk and abuse. Shout out to all prison guards. They are not all evil and jerks. Most are just doing a job that provide for their family like anyone else. My friend told me this story of his account, so I'll share. He was a prison guard in Arizona some years ago. On his way to work there was a monsoon. By the time he arrived the power was out and the backup generator was also out. When the power goes out like that, at least at this particular prison. So he arrived to no power and open prison cells. It was his job to go around with a mag light and tell everyone to stay calm. Stay in their cells and that food would be coming. Most inmates were cool and did as they were told. One particular man though was not so cool. My buddy approached a mammoth of a man leaning on the railing outside his cell with his arms folded. He towers over my friend. He is built like an ox and certainly outweighs him. When told to go back on his cell the inmate says, "What if I don't wanna?" So you're not supposed to back down to images obviously. So my buddy is shitting bricks but has to remain assertive. He tells him one more time to get back in his cell or else. The inmate doesn't care and takes a step towards him. My buddy swings the maglite into his face, knocking him out instantly. He found out later that he had knocked out the leader of the Aryan Brotherhood at that prison. He promptly put in his 2 weeks notice and spent the remainder of his time in a guard tower with a rifle. My mom was a correctional officer. She's retired now. I know the scariest day for me was when she called me from work one evening to tell me there was a riot happening at another unit. She wanted me to keep an eye on the news and called to let her know if they mentioned any officers at that unit dying in the riot. Because she and her co-workers had friends working there and they were worried. So I'm all of 14. Alone in the house one night with my baby sister. Watching a news story about a prison riot to make sure none of my mom's friends were hurt or killed. I think it was my first or second week on the job. It was a weekend evening so the jail was locked for 1730. At around 1800 one of the prisoners hit the emergency cell call. When I answered I could see the guy was off his tits on something. He demanded to see the nurse to get his medication. He had been called several times during the day by the nurse but was so wiped he stayed in bed. I told him this and he did not take it well. He produced 2 razor blades and swallowed them both, having the belief that this would somehow get him his medication. At the time I thought nothing in the job could possibly top what I had just seen. I worked for a state prison for about a year. The prison I worked for was really old. And oftentimes the security mechanisms were very bad. Things like doors being able to be picked and our radios not always working. I worked nights. From 6 PM to 6 AM. One night as I was doing one of my security checks, I found an inmate hanging. It was clearly set up as an ambush. When I saw it, I called it on the radio. but a group of inmates surrounded me. I had to call an extra code to say I needed extra assistance, an emergency code. When the group of inmates surrounded me, they were all shouting these chants over and over again. The same chants was one of the creepiest things and probably one of the scariest things I've been through. It didn't take long at all for other officers to get there, but I honestly thought I was gonna get killed. Apparently, it was this new STG that these guys had started. Cult-like almost. They were able to get in the inmates' room because we were unable to lock the doors in the range. I think that moment will never leave me. Sometimes I still have nightmares about it. Scottish ex-prison officer here. The worst prisoner I had to deal with was Mad Hammy, a homo-zool predator who was that evil that everyone tried to avoid even eye contact with him. He used to leave tobacco and sweeties on his bed and go to the other side of the landing and just watch. Eventually, prisoners being prisoners, someone would go into his cell to steal said items. They sealed their own fate as Hammy would then get them into his cell and pay them. He was that evil nobody would grass him up. UK prison here. Was only a few days off of leaving and had managed to avoid injury and dangerous situations throughout my time there. Anyway, that day I was working on the segregation unit and we had a rather troublesome individual who had been in there for a week or so. Due to his history of attempting to assault officers and escape his room whenever the door was opened, he was given specific rules that his door should never be opened without 3 officers present. So I'm sitting in the wing office and have the emergency alarm come over my radio. Turns out another officer, who wasn't somehow aware of not opening the door without presence, has opened his door and the inmate has bolted out. So being first on the scene, the inmate has ran straight at me full force as I'm walking through the door. Ended up flying kicking the heavy M. I was working a unit that has an open shower room with 12 showers. These showers are segregated by race. I had to monitor the showers to ensure there are no fights or F-king going on. There were 12 guys in the shower room with dozens waiting their turn. A guy walked in fully clothed to confront another guy in the shower. I noticed outside of the shower they were grouping up waiting to see what would happen. There are normally 3-4 officers in the area, so with 20-30 guys fighting it would have been rough until backups arrived. Luckily, a group of about 10 new officers came in being showed the area by a sergeant. I knocked on the shower window to get the 2 guys' attention that were facing off. They looked over and saw the extra 10 guys and separated. What they didn't know was the 10 new officers were still in the academy and would not have been authorized to help break up the fight. The inmates didn't know this. I didn't want to have to break up a bunch of naked dudes fighting.